Really well, folks, thanks so much for having me. I feel a slight imposter. I'm an engineer and a brewer talking about marketing to a whole load of people that know far more about marketing than I do. So let's see how it goes. This is our home. This is where we're from. As I've been said, this is where we farmed for 100 years. We used to have thousands and thousands of sheep running across this landscape. Hopefully, there should be three things you'll notice about this. One, it's beautiful, it really is. Second, it was a landscape that was very much formed by the rain, and rain is an important part of our story. And thirdly, there are very few houses in here. You know, I'll go to talks from other brewers. Where did I put my brewery? As near as many chimney stacks as you can possibly can. They want to be near to their audience. You can see, we don't have a big local audience. So right from the get-go, we've had to think about how do we actually get out and tell our story and push our brand out to other parts of the world. So, where's the thing? So let me just tell you a little bit about us, because I imagine not many people will know anything very much about us. We've been going as a brewery since 2001. This is where we are now. Actually, it's a tiny part of where we are now. We'll do about 60 or 70 different products this year. New product development will launch about one new product a week. Our industry is all about innovation. However, although it's all about innovation, this beer here, Jarl, is about more than half our turnover and is Scotland's biggest selling real ale, I think. I'm not totally sure of that. There aren't really any reliable statistics, but I think I'm now right in saying that is Scotland's leading real ale. I think real ale isn't really a thing in Ireland. It's sort of, actually I'll talk about that a little bit further down the way. But anyway, so we do a lot of real ales, we do a lot of what would probably be called premium bottled ales before, and then now very much in the craft beer sector as well. Scotland is our biggest market still. Our fastest growing market is England, but we sell a lot into a number of other countries around the world. Italy is probably our biggest export market. The States would be our second biggest export market. That's I think all that. Oh, and then I suppose the other thing that's just sort of worth noting is, as we mentioned, you know, we have had the farm's been in the family for sort of 100 years. It's not a business that we could ever see ourselves selling. So everything we've been trying to do is about building a long-term sustainable business. This is not a build it up and sell it in 5 years' time kind of a project. So everything we're trying to do is about the long-term evolution. So it's been a fairly sort of steady, progressive story about getting the foundations right. So what I'm going to do is just give you a little bit, and I'm going to try and make it fairly quick, just a little bit of an overview of our sort of story in terms of where we got to. And then Neve invited me sort of a couple of different ideas of things to talk about, and I'm really going to deep dive into one of our things where we discovered we were getting something quite wrong and what our learning points were from it. So I'll take you through the story first. So 2001, this is when we started. I'll be honest, it was essentially my parents started the business really as a bit of a retirement project. Dad had been working for Nestle. They wanted to move full-time back up into Argyll. And so it was like, well, what do we do? And the building you can see in the background here, this was an old dairy that wasn't even being used anymore. It didn't even have a roof at that stage. And so it was like, amongst other things I looked at, it was like, well, okay, why don't we put a brewery into here? Back in 2001, I mean, this was the days craft beer wasn't even a term. It didn't exist as a term in the UK market. It did exist in America, but no one had ever really heard of it in the UK. So it was back in the days of microbreweries. Microbreweries were a thing. Real ales were very much a thing. And in Argyll, if you wanted to get good beer, there really wasn't any. So if you talk about consumer insights, the simple consumer insight was, we want to drink good beer. There isn't anywhere near us. Let's make some good beer. That was really, really what it was all about to start off with. And you can see very much when we started, the original branding, this is the last bottle I can find anywhere. So that's the original branding. It was done by one of my cousins, very much lo-fi. You know, it was the brown paper format, actually, which Colonel still used down in London. But it was, you know, it was lo-fi branding, simple, Scottish-inspired, slightly sort of Celtic sort of patterns going on with it, and really just about how do we actually start to get that out and tell that story. And that was really sort of the product, you know, got going, and it was, you know, early days, you know, it was one of the handymen from the estate. He was a keen home brewer, so he went off, did some courses. He was the original brewer. Yeah, we were brewing once, twice a week. Mum and Dad were taking the Land Rover with a big trailer of beer on it, driving out to the pubs in Edinburgh and Glasgow and delivering it sort of door to door, just slowly sort of starting to introduce it to people. Slowly, we started to develop a sort of nice reputation, started to win a few awards. Awards are always nice. They're always very helpful in our industry, particularly more in those days. And so we sort of built our way steadily forward. As we came up to sort of 2008, we're still brewing on the same kit. This is still, we actually still have this brew house sitting in the barn, maybe looking a little bit less clean than that, but essentially it's all still there. And so that was still sitting there. We were brewing by that stage of, I think we were doing about £400,000 a year. The branding, we did this rebrand back in 2008, which really moved the old branding onto something. And at that stage, this was really kind of very modern for the beer market. It was sort of recognisably still real ale style branding, but it was kind of at the modern end of the real ale style branding, very much at the modern end. And what was interesting, this beer, Avalanche, was the first time that we produced a beer using American hops, which give quite a different flavour profile to European hops. So that was our sort of first foray into sort of slightly more modern, interesting sort of beers, which worked really well and sort of got a really good reputation. Again, really worked nicely. But at this stage, to be honest, it was still something of a glorified hobby. It was still a bit of a retirement project. It wasn't making any money as a business. It was being moderately tough going still, but it was sort of working along okay. Then, actually, I'm just gonna, yeah. But then, anyway, so then 2009, my father died. I had just sold my last business, so it was sort of a matter of sort of getting stuck in and seeing what we can do. At that stage, one of the first things I did actually was take myself over to America and see what was happening in the American beer scene. Because if you look at what's happening in America then and back in those days, and it was incredible compared with the UK. And I spent a bit of time going and visiting a lot of American breweries, understanding what their story had been. And you could really see, well, okay, if that could happen there, why couldn't it happen here? So we got stuck into really understanding that. And so what we became all about was really doubled down, trebled down on product quality focus. For us, the journey really between 2008 and 2017 was entirely and 100% about product quality focus. And that was what was driving our sales growth. We were putting in sort of 40% a year sales growth, and it was all about the quality of the beer. I don't think for most of that time, we didn't even employ a marketing person, and for much of it, we didn't even have a salesperson. So it was really just kind of like, if you make really good beer, people are going to want to buy it, and the word just sort of gets out there. Lots of going out to festivals. This is our brewery tap that we built in about 2014, 2015. That's sort of a selection of the awards that we've won over the years. The awards really help in terms of, again, sending out that quality beer message. So, the business was moving forward nicely. We built in an old sheep shed. My grandfather built the sheep shed back in the 1950s. We'd sort of stripped it out, converted it, put a much bigger new brewery into there. So that's now brewery is sort of capable of about 10, 12 million pints a year, the actual brew house element of it. So it's a much, much bigger brewery compared with the old one. Absolutely sort of state of the art, the modern way of doing a British craft beer. So that was like a £2.5 million investment we put into that. So we put a lot of money into that. We were getting that going right. We had a lot of fat, happy cattle because we were producing a lot of spent grain. My mother still runs the farm side of it, and as far as she's concerned, I run a business that makes feed for her cattle, and the beer's the byproduct. So she now has a deer farm as well because the cattle couldn't keep up. So we had a lot of fat, happy cattle. And then we'd created Jarl. Jarl was our real sort of flagship beer, which had really taken off. It was with a really modern, at the time we were the second brewery in the UK to get this new hop called Citra, which just gave this fantastic grapefruity aroma. And it was the epitome of what we were trying to do, marrying sort of new world ideas with old world style British brewing tradition. And Jarl had been a fantastic engine for us as a product. And so that had really taken us forward. Through that period, 2008 to 2009, I think social media had been our main form of marketing, and I was saying earlier that for me, 2010 to 2012 was the best point in social media's evolution. It was like the point when you really got conversations going with consumers and beer advocates, other people in the industry. It felt like there was a real depth and flow to the conversation, whereas today there's just so much that, if a conversation from 20 minutes ago is now lost way down everyone's timelines, it's vanished. In those days, it felt like conversations went on for days. And I remember we did a beer, Zombeer. It was a collab with some Glasgow homebrewers, and we had one last keg of it and a cask of it, and it was going out to a pub in Paisley, and people were being sent out every day to get a train from Glasgow to Paisley to go and find out if this pub had it on yet. And when eventually it went on, suddenly social media went alight and everyone was like, right, and everyone piled into Paisley to go and drink this beer there. It was that to me was like the best days of social media in a way. So that was the story. And so, we built a very loyal following. One of the core ways we build a following was we do a festival every year. And so I just want to introduce the festival to you because I think it'll tell you a little bit more about our brand. So the festival is called Fyne Fest, and we've got sort of a short video of it here, I think.
In the background there's a blind spot. Rolling dice and mark your cards out. Don't push the luck and lose the money. All your cheaters won't impress me. Those pocket queens and closet aces. Full house of painted faces. Dealing us so they connect us. Your winning smile is infectious. Drag me down, go comfort lane. Baby, when it's over, we gon' start it again. Drag me down, go comfort lane. Baby, when it's over, we gon' start it again. That is square for the lost found. Bare your chest and dance your heart out. I only meant to make your bones shake. Please forgive me if my lips quake. I'm out of stencil in your heart clutch. Yeah, you tell me you don't dance too much. Arms blurring through the encore as you tear it from the dance floor. Drag me down, go comfort lane. Baby, when it's over, we gon' start it again. Drag me down, go comfort lane. Baby, when it's over, we gon' start it again. The circus goes on your red lips. Walk the floor, but on your red lips, you just outside. She got you in her sights.
So that's a little bit, and the reason for showing you that, I'm going to come back to that slide, hang on, because I'm getting ahead of myself. So the reason for showing you that is just to show you a little bit about kind of what it was that sort of was driving our growth. That's kind of who our audience was. We get about 3,000 people every year come up to the brewery for a weekend of that festival, and it's because they're into the location, the provenance, the story, the food, the drink, the quality of the beers. And you saw, at the end, we're really putting the beer at the front. Where a music festival would have the bands, we're kind of putting the beers there. And it's kind of a unique event in the industry in the UK, but it's kind of sums up what we were about as a brand. However, that was all very good. It was all working. It was all going on well. But when Niamh was asking me to come and talk today, she gave me various different things I could possibly talk about. And one of them was about how consumer insight could have its role in forming our strategy. And the reason that was relevant is that although there seemed to be a lot of things that we were doing very well, what we actually found is that the growth that we'd built our new brewery for, we weren't seeing that coming through. And so we thought, well, okay, we've never spent any money on marketing, but it's actually time to employ a marketing manager and time to think about what we're doing in our marketing journey. And really what I'm going to tell you now is a story about where our perception and where our consumers' perceptions were actually in quite different places and the problems that was causing us. So before I can do that, I just need to tell you a little bit, and I don't really want to talk about craft beer, But my point is that you've actually got to work out, if you want to understand where you are, you need to understand your frame of reference. And the difficulty that we have as a small brand that's challenging in a big industry is the way we see the industry is different to how the big guys see the industry. And so if you talk to people like Kantar and Nielsen and the big research organizations, well, they write reports for the people who want to spend money on reports, and they're the big guys. So then none of them are actually producing any information which talks to us and tells people about our industry and the people the way that we see it. So I just need to explain a little bit. So craft beer, what is craft beer? Well, this is one view from a nice chap, Simon Johnson, back in 2012. So there are only 7 ingredients in craft beer. Hops, malt, water, yeast, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. Tells us 2 things. Instagram didn't exist in 2012. That's the first thing you learn from that. But I think his point here is almost that craft beer was just beer marketed to millennials. Perhaps you could say, take the slightly cynical view. That's the view of it. And actually, that way is the way that you would probably say that Heineken, with their acquisition of Beavertown and Lagunitas, probably views craft beer. And there's probably a lot of validity to that view. There's another view of craft beer, which I've sort of summed up actually with a quote from Douglas Adams. I don't know how many have read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, probably lots. But he's talking here about dimensions from a higher being, from a higher, what does he call it? A higher dimension. Beings from a higher dimension who are playing block-in ultra cricket. And it's a nasty game, but anyone who's been to higher dimensions will know they're pretty nasty heathen lot up there who should be smashed done in and would be too if anyone could work out a way of firing missiles at right angles to reality. Now, this to me actually sums up Brewdog's marketing strategy. As far as they're concerned, the macro beer guys, they're the heathens from the higher dimension who should be smashed and done in, and craft beer is the missile at right angles to reality that's going to smash the big macro guys' market up. I think there's some truth to that as well. Because actually, what we're doing is we're actually seeing the same market from a totally different angle. So we are at right angles to reality. The macro beer world is about producing big standard products which is inoffensive to lots of people and therefore can be marketed. And their whole supply chain, their manufacturing, their marketing, their routes to market, is all about shifting huge volumes very cost effectively. We're all about producing small batches of beer that get small groups of excitement, small groups of consumers really excited about it. So we are kind of at right angles to reality. I go to the Craft Brewers Conference in the States, and I can learn huge amounts. I go to the European Brewing Congress, which is pitched to the big guys, and I can learn almost nothing because we're just talking different languages, even though the technology is very similar. Now, I'm not knocking the big guys, because I think there are some brilliant guys in the big guys, so I don't at all subscribe to the ideas that they're heathens. There are some really good guys who work for the macro breweries, and they are technically brilliant at what they do. So, I wouldn't totally subscribe to that view, but I think it's certainly one way that people look at the market. So really what that's saying is that if we're going to understand where we stand, we have to understand our market. And what it also said is that if we're looking at it differently to the way the mainstream market looks at itself, we have to go and think about it differently ourselves. So one of the first things we had to do was to work out our framework and our way that we wanted to think about the market. And we had a lot of debate about this. It's one of those things, a big conversation. And so this, I think, is this is a UK market slide. This is not applicable, it certainly wouldn't be applicable in the States. It wouldn't be applicable in Italy, which I know quite well. I don't think it'd be applicable in Ireland, but I don't know the market so well. But this is very illustrative. Don't take anything too literal off this. But the way we were thinking about it was there's a sort of axis of beer, which kind of goes from like bog standard lager. In the UK, that would be Carling, which is the biggest selling lager in the UK, right the way through. So first through the real ales, which is like the micro-brewed some macro-brewed, some micro-brewed real ales, then into this sort of craft space, which you'll all be familiar with now as craft brewing, and then up to now the uber craft end, which is sort of the barrel fermented sour stuff that is inherently very small batch, very long, slow fermentations, like years slow fermentations. So we said that the market can be sort of viewed like that way. And to a degree, what I'm trying to say is that, Very small number of brands, but very, very, very high volumes. I mean, this would have to be a log scale. I mean, they'd be way up there. In terms of volumes, small number of brands there, then a much bigger number of brands, smaller volumes. This area here now perhaps is going up much faster, but again, a big, wide range of brands, lots of different beers, lower volumes, and then here, not that many brands, because it's a really niche bit of space, but compacted down thing. I'll talk a bit about that bit later on. So that was how we sort of saw the market. And what we were seeing is that back in 2017, when we sort of started this exercise, we were selling lots of beer into this space. We had beers in this space, which this was the hot, cool space that everyone was talking about, but our beers just weren't really selling very well in here. So we had some beers, we thought they were good beers, they won prizes at competitions, they were doing quite well. And we weren't used to putting out a beer that wasn't doing well. But we had beers in this space that just weren't doing very well. And then we were doing some things up at this end of the space. I remember, I think in 2016, 2017, we did the UK's first Italian grey pale, which is like a beer-wine hybrid. And if our friends down at Wild Beer had done that beer, people would have been raving over it. It was a very good, credible attempt at sort of merging beer and wine together in terms of a new beer. And it completely bombed in the market. We liked it. Other brewers that we gave it to, sampled, just drank it with, they liked it. But it just bombed. It just was a commercial, total flop. And so we were sort of stuck with this thing where we had this great machine working down here, but a lot of the stuff that we wanted to do more of in here was just not selling. So we needed to get out and talk to our consumers and understand what was going on. So we did quite a lot of internet surveys. I think about 1,000 people filled in various surveys for us. We did some focus groups to go and talk to people. And really what came out of it was actually, that was what people knew us for, Jarl. And people's perceptions of us was just like Jarl had been quite cutting edge, but actually now it's kind of quite a middle of the road standard real ale. It had slipped down here. So even though it had an absolutely huge fan base, that was it. And as far as everyone else was concerned, Fyne Ales was Jarl. And although we were doing all these other beers, people were coming up to our brewery, they were buying them and everything, but that hadn't really got out into the market, into the consciousness. So we'd become a bit of a one-product brewery. So that wasn't where we wanted to be at all, because that wasn't how we saw ourselves, and that also we didn't feel was reflected where we wanted to be for the future of the business either. We didn't want to be a single brand brewery. It's not that fun, it's not that interesting. So this is kind of where we wanted ourselves to be, which was sort of centred on, because the difference between Jarl and, say, Beavertown's, neck oil there, Session IPA, is kind of a hop and a skip in beer terms. They're very close to each other, those two beers. Or Easy Trail, which some of you got under your chairs. These are actually very close to each other in terms of beer terms. And so what we wanted to do was to move our centre of Fyne Ales gravity. So it was about both the real ales and the craft keg. And in so doing, give ourselves permission to sell and to play in the kind of stuff that as brewers we really like doing up at this end as well. So that was what we wanted to achieve, and the question was how to achieve it. So we set out, we really sort of wrote all this up as a marketing brief, sort of set of positioning statements, all the rest of it, went out and spoke to a number of different design agencies. Eventually settled on a really great design agency in Glasgow called O Street. And they took our sort of lovingly crafted sort of 3-paragraph positioning statement and said, well, okay, we can't work with 3 paragraphs. What we need is 3 words. So they made us sit down and slowly, sort of sentence by sentence, strip out all the extraneous stuff. And so we kind of drilled it down eventually to sort of 3 main things which we felt really underpinned Fyne Ales as a business. Roots, which is our sense of where we're from, that glen, that shot of the glen in Scotland, all those people coming up for our festival, where we're from there. The community, whether it's the sort of team of people we've got working in the brewery, which is integral to who we are, but also our wider group of customers, because we did have a very intense fan base. People are really into what we do. But then also this sort of notion of progress and ambition. We're not trying to be stand still. We're about the future of beer, we're not about the past of beer. So we want this idea of progress in there as well. So they took those ideas and they created a new brand identity for us, really trying to work, and we went through Lord knows how many iterations with them, but I guess that's true with everyone every time you do these projects. And so we put together this new brand identity. And it was a big wrench, getting away from something which had seen us go from nothing up to sort of a sort of £2 million a year business. Was it had been a lot of our sort of previous brand identity. I think my mother is still slightly traumatized by the fact we got rid of it, but a bit of therapy, she'll get over that, I think. And so we put together this as our identity. And I won't go through all the details, but it was very much, it was all about how do we get that sense of place back into the brand. And so by badging ourselves Farm Brewery, we're now in an industry when in the UK, there's about 2,000 breweries in the UK. We're one of the top 50 size-wise, so we're one of the big guys out there. But it feels like every railway arch, every little trading estate on the edge of every small town has got a brewery in it. So one of the things that made us most distinct was to go for this farm brewery sort of link. And it feels like established 2001. We've been around for a while, so it's given us a little bit of gravitas. Kept Dad's signature on as well, because Dad definitely had a bit of gravitas. But at the same time, trying to bring in a slightly more modern, trendier aspect to it. And what that's really enabled us to do is exactly what we set out to do. I've been talking far too fast, but that's good. Or not good, so apologies. So what we set out to do is to do this. And this has really worked very well for us in terms of where the structures come from. So, Jarl is still being very much our flagship. We love Jarl to bits. It is, as I said, it's Scotland's biggest selling real ale. It's now in sort of high single-digit percentage growth, which is nice for a relatively good beer. Then in our sort of crossover patch, where we're doing much more play-around beers, but still sort of on the real ale side of the spectrum, we're sort of seeing a high 50s to 60% a year growth consistently over the last year in that sort of territory. But now when we've come over onto this side, we've suddenly got branding that works, and we're seeing sort of 100 to 200% a year growth on this side. And so these two new core beers for us have been absolutely fantastic and are really pushing out the volume exactly where we want them to be. And so now when we do things like, this is Sour Friends on the Beach, which is part of our Kettle Sour series, which is like, this one's sort of themed on cocktails, so it's orange, peach and cranberry flavoured Kettle Sour. That now sells really well. So the branding has absolutely enabled us to do what we wanted to do, which is to get beers out into this part of the market, which is the faster growing, the more exciting part of the market, and really push those sales growth numbers forward. So absolutely. Now, our question about whether the branding would give us permission to play in this space suddenly does. And before, where people couldn't really see the links, and I didn't really show you some of the other older branding images because the branding was a bit all over the place, suddenly now this sort of Fyne Ales Farm Brewery ties across everything, and people can see that's all from the same brewery. I love that, I should try that. And there's enough of a theme between the beers that it makes sense to people. We also, at the end here, we have our Fyne Ales Origins brewing. The Origins brewing is almost like our distillation. If brewers are allowed to distill, they're not allowed to distill in the UK, but it's our sort of distillation of our brand. It's trying to put our sense of place actually into the glass. And so these beers, it's really a very experimental, developmental project. It's about exploring what it means to be a brewer in Argyll right now, at this point in time, at the exact location where we are in Scotland. So it's all about using the microflora that's wild in the glen around us. So we're doing spontaneously fermented beers. So rather than using normal brewer's yeast, we just use whatever yeast is growing in the environment. We're foraging for herbs locally. We're finding locally grown fruit. We're finding any way that we can to tell the story of time and place actually in the beers. And so these sort of beers, we're about to release our first 3-year blend of spontaneous beer. The first bit, which was brewed in 2015. So, it's sort of beer that was brewed in 2015, some more in 2016, some more in 2017. So these are very slow beers. But they're great for telling a story. And what this has been able to do is to keep us absolutely relevant for the really interesting end of the market. And again, it becomes clearer then to people, okay, they can produce Jarl, they've got this really well-respected group right up here at this end of the spectrum. It sort of gives us permission to sell in the middle as well, and a wider bit of the range there. So that's really what we've done with our branding. I hope that's been useful and interesting. This is us today. This is where we're at. You can see it's, as we stand here, sort of 2019, you know, we're still absolutely, we love Jarl. Jarl is our flagship beer. Jarl is becoming a sort of a really good go-to beer across the UK, and our big focus at the moment is on how do we grow that in England and push that out more and more into England to get the kind of level of penetration in England that we have in Scotland. We're also thinking very much about how do we actually take this message about our sort of sense of place and where we're from and tell that story to markets much further afield, whether it's here in Ireland or in Japan or the States or Italy and places like that. And so now we're very much looking at the next stage of our evolution as to how do we tell that story and push that story further out the way. And social media continues to be an absolutely key part of that in the digital world, absolutely. And a lot of actually just getting out to events as well makes a huge difference in our world. And then at the same time, you know, we're sort of moving into a world that's almost going post-craft beer in the UK. You know, in the UK, we've seen, you know, sort of craft beer kind of wasn't a thing in 2009, 2010. Now we get to 2019, it's almost been appropriated by the big brands. You know, craft beer is becoming almost synonymous in a way with some of the big brands. And we're back to talking about just what is really good beer from a small producer like. And, you know, we've got to actually sort of not be on the same territory as Heineken or Guinness with their sort of fake craft beer brands. And we've actually got to be on a different territory, which is just how do we actually really engage with our consumers just as producers of beer. So that's us. That's our challenges for the moment. I hope that was useful in some way. Thank you very much for inviting me.